everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm talking about How Minds Change by David McCready. This is about the science of belief, opinion and persuasion. And it's another non-fiction book. Last week I talked about Don't Shoot the Dog by Karen Pryor. Just filmed that video, this is why I still have my international blah 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 IABC teacher on. I'm an equine behaviour consultant by profession, it's my day job, and a lot of that is to do with human behaviour change. The horse world is, kind of stuck in the past a little bit. It's not very positive reinforcement based. A lot of the time it's quite punishment and negative reinforcement based. There's a lot of horse use in sport. There's a lot of, strange opinions and misconceptions about horses and, just kind of bad habits in the culture, misbeliefs in the culture. And so my work, I'm working like an uphill battle to try and change that, and I do get very disillusioned with it sometimes. It can be hard. So when I saw this book, and I'm constantly working to try and change people's minds and bring them on side, I was like, perfect, I need this book in my life. And I loved it. It was a 5-star read. It really blew my mind and gave me a lot of hope, honestly. I know I don't often talk about non-fiction books on this channel, and it's mainly a fiction-based channel, but if you, are considering reading a bit more non-fiction, I would really recommend this. It was written in a really accessible style. I felt like I was reading a documentary, like a Louis Theroux documentary. It wasn't overly bogged down in the science or anything. It was truly very accessible, but still very intellectually stimulating, and I learned so much from this book. In this book, he talks a lot about conspiracy theorists. He talks about 9/11 truthers. He talks about flat earthers, people in the Westboro Baptist Church, and he goes and speaks to them one-on-one, tries to understand why they have the beliefs that they have, how they came to these realizations, and more importantly, how they might have moved away from that and changed their minds. I think it's very easy for people to ridicule people like flat earthers and just go there, they're just fanatics, they're just silly, and the reality of it is much more complex than that. Once you get into the meat of it, you find that these flat earthers, they actually have a community around it. They have friendships, they might have family members that all share in this belief that the earth is flat, and it becomes almost a part of who they are. And so letting go of that belief, even when the evidence is like overwhelming in opposition to that, it's really hard for them to do. This is why people get stuck in cults, because reckoning with this reality that everything you believe is nonsense and is harmful is truly really hard to do. It can involve overhauling your whole identity and even casting out family and friends. If all of your family and friends are in the Westboro Baptist Church, for example, even if you start to doubt it yourself, it's hard to leave it because you love your family and friends. And if you leave the church, you might not have them anymore. You might be out on your own. So our social connections and what the people around us, the people that we care about, believe in, really keeps us stuck in those potentially false beliefs. I think it's important for us to look at the things that we believe strongly in and see, is this in line with what all my friends and family think? And if it is, it might seem like, water is white. It might seem totally obvious to you and you're like, well, of course I believe that. And that's fine, if it's true. But if everyone around you believes that same thing, how much of that is social pressure? And ask yourself, what would you think if none of my family and friends believed this? Would you still believe it? Is it coming from inside the house? Or is it coming from how you're socialised? I think it's important every now and again to maybe have a think about this, take stock of your beliefs. Maybe not every single one, like 2 + 2 = 4, but 1984, even that could be manipulated by some broader force. So maybe look at like your political beliefs, your religious beliefs, and see, do I really believe this? Or is it because it's become a part of my family or my identity? And you might do that work and even come to the conclusion that actually, I'm not willing to change my mind about this because the stakes are too high. I think I come across this in the horse world quite a lot. Most of us grow up like riding horses, doing pony club, doing little shows. You might go to the races, you might watch horse shows, and be a little bit blind to some of the abuses or the welfare issues that go on here. And I used to use punishment with my own horse. I don't anymore now that I know better, but it's it's standard. It's very accepted in the equestrian world. It's what you're taught as a child, to like buy a pink glittery whip and hit your pony with it if they're naughty, and that's completely wrong. But coming to believe that and changing your mind about that, it involves reckoning with the fact that you've done wrong, that you've done bad, that you've maybe lived your life a certain way for 10 or 20 years that was actually damaging the horse or the horses that you love. Because no one gets into horse riding or the horse industry because they hate horses and want to abuse them. Very few people, anyway. Most people love horses, they love riding, they love their horses, they're like their babies, and yet they'll go and give them a smack when they feel it's warranted, despite the fact that evidence shows that that is, 99 times out of 100 not an effective way to manage behaviour. And not everyone is willing to turn their back on that. If you are like have stakes in the racing industry and that's your entire career, of course you don't want to see racing banned. You probably love your thoroughbred horses as well. So you don't want to see them becoming surplus, becoming mass culled because they're suddenly useless. I think a mass ban would be a bit of a disaster economically and, from a welfare standpoint. We need, probably more gradual change, but you can see how stakeholders in the industry, they would be unemployed without it. So can you really expect them to change their minds on it and say this is 100% cruel now? No. The same way that people in the meat industry that work there are not going to turn around and say this is cruel and everyone should be vegan, because then like their livelihood would just be dead. And so when you're trying to change someone's mind and they are very entrenched in maybe this wrong thing or this thing that you think is wrong, sometimes it's maybe best to walk away if you can see like, okay, their identity and like everything that they are is really tied up in this false belief, and it can be potentially unethical to try and change that. He touches on this in this book. There might be some things where you're like, you do want to change the opinion of people in the racing industry, for example, but he touches on this with religion. He has this conversation with someone who's very religious, and they talk about why they're religious, why they believe in God, this hope that it gives them in their life, how it makes their life better. And this was in front of a crowd, and I think it was him, it might have been someone else. It was a year ago that I read this. But, he comes to the conclusion during this conversation, like, yes, I could sit here and posit some atheism arguments and try to dismantle this person's belief in God. But actually, this is very important to them. It's important to their well-being. It's not hurting someone else, they're not using their religion to oppress others. So in this situation, it's not ethical for me to try and change that person's mind. And I think, we should all think about this as well. I think, we're in a culture where we're very strong in our opinions. We're very strong in getting online and saying, you're a bad person if you don't think this way. And, it's ridiculous. You just need to change. But we need to understand that this is complex and that, people actually don't always need to change. There are some instances where you can live and let live. Like someone being a flat earther, yes, they're wrong, but is that hurting anyone? No. Whereas someone being a 9/11 truther, that could potentially be harmful. And he actually visits with, is it Charlie Hebdo? Might be Charlie Hebdo or someone else, a 9/11 truther who changed their mind about it being fake and it being an inside job. And what changes his mind is that he goes and meets with victims, people whose family were killed in 9/11, and by talking about their first-hand experience and talking to these people that had suffered because of this act, seeing how that they suffered from this narrative of people constantly bringing it up as it's fake, it's an inside job, kind of spitting on the tragedy a little bit. He saw the damage that his beliefs had on these victims, and that's what forced him to change his mind. And that wasn't done through people arguing and getting into a big fight about it. It was just people sharing their experience, and he changed his mind on his own. This is another important factor about changing people's minds. You actually can't force people. They have to do it themselves. You can give someone the information and you can kind of nurture a change in attitude or a change in belief, but it all comes down to that person at the end of the day. They can take in all of this information, but because of cognitive dissonance, it allows us to take two separate beliefs and hold them at once, even if they contradict each other. People can have all of the information that eating meat is wrong, it's immoral, it's bad for the planet, it's bad for the animals, and yet still eat meat. It doesn't matter how good your argument is or how good your evidence is. It all comes down to an emotional attitude change from inside the house. In the beginning of this book, David McCraney goes into a lot of the neuroscience about perception as well, which I found particularly fascinating as a psychologist. I studied psychology at university. He talks about the dress. Remember that viral blue and black versus white and gold dress that went viral many years ago. And scientists discovered using this phenomenon that people's prior experience of light in different contexts, like if they'd worked outside a lot versus working in an office with artificial light a lot, that actually informed whether they seen the dress as white and gold or black and blue. And this was completely unconscious. It's just your brain takes in information and that informs how it processes certain things. And then because of those prior experiences, it becomes really difficult and impossible to see things a different way. And our beliefs are like this as well. There was another fascinating study discussed in this book about kittens and raising them from birth. One set of kittens were raised in a world or in a little environment that didn't have any horizontal lines. All of the lines were vertical or curved. And the other set of cats were raised in the opposite, so they didn't have any vertical lines, but they had horizontal and wavy lines. And can't remember how long, maybe they were raised for like up to the age of 2 or 3 weeks like this, maybe it was even 6. But cats that had never been in an environment since birth that had any horizontal lines could not perceive horizontal lines. So when you took them out of that environment and put them on a table, for example, which is horizontal, they would just walk off the edge of it because their brains hadn't made the neural connections to make sense of that and view it. Same goes for the vertical line cats. They would just walk into walls because their brains literally could not see it. And this holds true for opinions and beliefs as well. If you've never experienced something, your brain just will not have any kind of structures in place for perceiving that and believing that. So it takes some adjustment to start to be like, oh, actually this is possible. It's like believing in ghosts. Like for some people that's just not logical and doesn't make any sense. Their brain can't make sense of it. It would take a lot of evidence and a lot of perception for them to believe that. And try to think of a colour that isn't on the colour wheel, that doesn't exist. These colours do exist, but you can't perceive them because you've only got 3 cone cells. Dogs only have 2 cone cells, horses too, so they can't see red and green. They're basically red-green colourblind. You could not explain what the colour green or what the colour red looks like to someone with red-green colour blindness or a dog. They can understand you anyway. But yeah, you cannot conceive of a colour that you can't perceive because your brain just literally can't do it. So sometimes beliefs are like that. It takes a while for people to be primed into a position where they can believe certain things. One of the really comforting elements of this book, which gives that very hopeful edge, is that beliefs, it can feel like an uphill battle for beliefs to change, but once they do, it happens like this. Once upon a time, homophobia was the standard. Not very long ago, 10 years since gay marriage was legalized in America. And before that, even Barack Obama was, not super supportive of gay rights. But once the gay rights movement took off and once gay marriage was legalized, it totally flipped. It's 80% of people were homophobic, and then within 5 years, 80% of people are not homophobic. So there has been a rapid, drastic change, and it's you go uphill, uphill, uphill. You're the innovator, you're, trying to get people to believe, and people are, fighting it, they're really laggard about it. And then all of a sudden, it gets this tipping point, and then it's yeah, love is love. And, there's going to be a few homophobes, a few laggards that didn't come with it, but most people will be yeah, I've always thought it was fine. Even though they didn't, which is very annoying, but also very good. So you know, these things, these topics that you really care about, that you're really working for, one day, you know, it might happen. You might get to that point where, like, you know what, being gay is fine, and like hardly anyone is homophobic now. That's what it feels like anyway. I know there's still a problem, but the majority of people, even a lot of religious people, are just like, well, I don't understand it. God does what God does. And it's only really a minority of people that are, you know, gays are going to hell, Westboro Baptist Church style, you know, believers. And that's a great thing. That's, you know, a positive example. On the other end, like, beliefs can also flop in the way that you don't want them to. This effect works both ways. As quickly as people can flop in favour of gay rights, they can also maybe flop back if, you know, some bad things happen and the conditions become right for it. So, you know, that's important to be aware of as well. We don't want to like push too hard to the point where people start to flip-flop in the other direction, which seems to be what's happening with trans rights and people's opinions about trans and non-binary people. People are getting sick of the rhetoric, and so people like J.K. Rowling, who would have 10 years ago been supportive of gay rights, saying, yeah, Dumbledore was gay the whole time, supportive of trans people, are now flip-flopping into that TERF direction because, you know, it's wearing on them. And then as she flip-flops, a lot of other people flip-flop. And as a result, we're seeing a regression in the general public's attitudes to trans people, whereas before wasn't really a topic on the radar. But, you know, there's hope. The world is becoming very polarised, and it's easy to like look at J.K. Rowling and demonise her and be, you know, hostile towards her. Lots of people are being. But the evidence in this book about how minds change show that by having considerate conversations and by being open and by understanding the psychology of how minds change, we can get to a more peaceful place where we're getting on the same page. I know she's not doing that. She's been openly quite hostile and been like, oh, what is a woman? She's not helping her case in that sense, and you can see how that's really turned against her because she's not doing that. She's not doing what this book advises. You know, let's vow not to be like her. Let's all have some more open discussions, and you know, we're going to disagree with people about things. We're going to have beliefs that contradict each other, but by talking, by weighing up when it's a good time to try and change someone's mind and when it is not, you know, we can have smooth relationships with others, and we can strive to achieve these social changes in the world that we want to. I hope that one day that opinion is going to flop and most horse people are, you know, outraged at the idea of smacking their horse with a glittery pink whip. But we're not there yet. I think the public is there. I think the public, when you point that out, are like, yeah, that seems cruel. And it kind of is, because it's applied pretty poorly. But, you know, the horse world, it's not quite there yet. It's getting there. We're climbing. Maybe we're here. Maybe we're here. Not here. Not in the flip-flop. But we're getting there. And I'm not running around being a nightmare, demonising people, being like, I won't talk to you then, and doing exposés on them. I'm talking to people that have these views, these opinions, that disagree, that say, you know, I think using food to train horses is bullshit, and that, you know, it's dangerous and it's going to teach them to bite. And I'm going, yeah, that's interesting. Here's why you're wrong, and here's why, you know, that's a valid concern if you do it wrongly, but if you do it right, it's amazing. And you don't need to be hitting your horse, and you don't need to be bullying them. You can actually have a harmonious relationship. Might need to use a bit of food, but that's fine. What's the big deal? Why do you care so much and have such a moral opposition to using food to train your horse, but no moral opposition to like whipping them and hitting them and dragging them around the place? Yeah, it's baffling, but I get it. I understand where they're coming from, and I know how hard it is to change. I know what their history is because I share the same history, and I know how hard it is for them to reckon with the reality that they might be wrong. So even when I disagree with people, I try to have compassion for them, and hopefully having that compassionate approach means that one day they might get on board and change their mind. And if they don't, they don't. I can't control other person's thoughts and opinions. If I could, I would be a dictator, and that'd be wrong. So the cost of freedom, unfortunately, is that people can believe all sorts of nonsense, and you can try to change their minds, but you might have to just leave them to it, leave them to their consequences of that, and yeah, try to be respectful even when it's hard. Let me know if you've read this book, let me know your thoughts and if you got as much out of it as I did. It's a really fascinating topic. Obviously I've referenced, gay rights and trans issues and 9/11 and lots of controversial topics in the comments that people have strong opinions on. Try to keep it respectful, considerate and compassionate in the comments. That's how we make the world a better place at the end of the day. Subscribe to this channel for more bookish chats, mostly fiction books, but if you enjoyed this and you want to hear me talk more about behaviour, animal behaviour, psychology, let me know. I'll read some more books along those lines and we can talk about them here. I am a professional with behaviour, human behaviour change, animal behaviour training, so if you like this and you want to learn more, please let me know. I do have another channel and an Instagram dedicated to it because it's my job. I don't make content on there anymore. I never really did, to be fair. I made like 6 videos or something. But if this is popular and people like it, maybe I'll do more. I just don't want to burn out by doing it as a full-time job and then doing it in my spare time. Can't run 2 channels at once, but if this blows up, then maybe I'll switch my focus to that because, I think that would probably make a bigger difference in the world. Don't know. Let me know in the comments if you like it. But do also subscribe to this channel because I'm putting all of the effort here at the moment. This is where you'll find me weekly. And thank you for watching. Bye!